Saudi Arabia poured $17 billion into wheat fields that vanished. Australia's billion-dollar eucalyptus forests shriveled back to sand. Libya's grand desert pipelines now lie broken beneath the Sahara. Time after time, the world tried to conquer deserts. It lost. Yet in one of Earth's harshest wastelands, China quietly achieved what experts said was impossible. Forests grew where only sand had been. How did China succeed where billion-dollar projects failed? And what does it reveal about the true logic of deserts? The answer starts with a forgotten pattern of collapse. In the late 1970s, Saudi Arabia set out to grow wheat in the desert, fueled by oil revenues and a drive for food security. Engineers drilled deep into ancient aquifers, tapping water that had been locked underground for thousands of years. Center pivot irrigation systems appeared almost overnight, transforming empty stretches of sand into vast circles of green visible from space. The government paid farmers guaranteed prices and covered the cost of wells, pumps, and equipment. Within a decade, wheat production soared. By the mid-1980s, Saudi Arabia was exporting millions of tons of wheat each year, briefly outpacing some European producers. But beneath the surface, the aquifers were shrinking. Hydrologists warned that this was fossil water with almost no natural recharge. As pumping continued, wells ran deeper, energy costs climbed, and water quality declined. By the early 2000s, the warning signs could not be ignored. In 2008, authorities announced a phased end to domestic wheat production. By 2016, output had collapsed to a fraction of its peak. The wheat boom had lasted less than 40 years. The desert reclaimed the fields, leaving only faint green scars on satellite images, and a stark lesson in the limits of mining ancient water for short-term gain. In northern Australia, the Ord River irrigation scheme began with a vision of lush fields stretching across the Kimberley. Technocrats built massive dams in the 1960s and 1970s, creating Lake Argyle, Australia's largest reservoir by volume. The plan called for tens of thousands of hectares under irrigation, with cotton, rice, and sugarcane as flagship crops. But the land itself refused to cooperate. Cotton fields quickly became battlegrounds against Heliodhis caterpillars, forcing farmers into a losing war with pesticides. Floods in the wet season and waterlogging in the dry left rice and sugar struggling. By the 1980s, less than a tenth of the planned irrigation area was actually cultivated. Most of the water sat unused behind concrete walls. Pests, outbreaks, salinity creeping up from over-irrigation, and chronic underutilization turned the scheme into a cautionary tale. Even when sugar made a brief comeback in the 1990s, global prices collapsed and the mill shut its doors. The dams remained, but the promise of a green northern frontier faded, leaving behind a landscape defined more by empty canals and abandoned fields than by thriving farms. In the heart of the Sahara, Libya set out to conquer the desert with engineering. The Great Man-Made River Project began in 1984, drilling deep into the Nubian sandstone aquifer to tap ancient reserves of fossil water. Over the next 3 decades, construction crews laid more than 4,000 kilometers of giant concrete pipelines, some sections stretching wider than a city bus. By the early 1990s, water was flowing north to Benghazi, Tripoli, and the coastal plains, fueling both urban growth and ambitious new farms. The project consumed more than $25 billion, with government planners describing it as the 8th wonder of the world. But the promise was always fragile. The aquifer could not refill on any human timescale, and every drop pumped north was water that would never return. Engineers warned of the risks, corrosion, leaks, and the sheer difficulty of maintaining such a vast network in a harsh climate. When Libya descended into conflict in 2011, those warnings became reality. Armed groups seized control of well fields and pumping stations. Power outages left entire cities without water for days or weeks. Years of neglected maintenance and direct attacks on infrastructure led to repeated shutdowns. Today, the pipelines still snake across the desert, but the flow is uncertain, vulnerable to politics and sabotage, and dependent on a resource that, once gone, is gone for good. In the Kubuki Desert, the restoration began with a simple but radical step: stop the sand from moving. Crews fanned out across the dunes, pressing bundles of wheat straw into the ground in a tight, repeating grid. Each square, about 1 meter across, formed a low barrier that broke the wind and trapped drifting sand. From above, these checkerboards looked like a patchwork quilt sewn into the desert. On the ground, they turned once shifting dunes into anchored shallow basins. Within 2 years, the sand settled, its surface hardened, and the relentless march of dunes slowed to a crawl. sand, and settled. With the sand stabilized, field teams turned to the next phase, planting the pioneers. They did not import foreign trees or flood the desert with water. Instead, they chose species that had survived here for millennia. Saxaul, with roots that reached deep for hidden moisture, was planted to brace dunes from within. Sea buckthorn, a spiny shrub covered in bright orange berries, formed dense thickets whose roots knit the sand together and quietly enriched it with nutrients. Licorice, prized for its long, creeping roots, was threaded between the shrubs, binding the ground horizontally and holding precious moisture after rare rains. These plants were not just survivors, they were builders, laying down the first threads of a living fabric where nothing had held before. Grasses and small shrubs formed the first green lines in the grid. Their fine roots glued the top layer of sand, and their stems caught windblown dust, slowly turning pale sand into a darker, richer mix. Over several seasons, dead leaves and organic debris gathered, building the beginnings of real soil. Each year, the ground became a little less harsh, a little more able to hold water through the long, dry months. Soil. As the soil improved, the crews introduced a new caste of species, trees whose shade would cool the ground and further slow evaporation. At sites with enough moisture, poplars and willows rose above the shrubs, forming shelter belts that buffered wind and created microclimates. The process was slow and deliberate. In the early years, every seedling needed help, with water hauled in barrels, fences to keep out grazing animals, and constant replanting where drought or sandstorms claimed the weak. It took 5 years before the first patches could survive a full season without human intervention. But once established, these patches began to expand on their own, each year pushing the edge of green a little farther into the desert. 5 years. The method relied on patience and precision. There was no rush to plant forests overnight. The crews watched the land, adjusted their planting to match the contours of each dune, and let the ecosystem dictate the pace. By working with the desert's own logic, stabilizing sand, building soil, and layering hardy plants, they created a living barrier that could withstand the region's punishing climate. The result was not a uniform forest, but a mosaic of grasses, shrubs, and trees, each chosen for its ability to survive and support the next stage of recovery. This 3-step approach transformed the Kubuki from a landscape of drifting sand into a patchwork of life, built from the ground up and designed to last. Patience. From above, the Kubuki Desert tells its own story. Satellite records spanning 3 decades reveal a landscape in motion, patches of deepening green spreading across what was once unbroken sand. The change is visible in the numbers as well as the imagery. In the late 1980s, vegetation was sparse, confined to isolated pockets where sand stabilization efforts had just begun. By 2000, remote sensing analysts recorded a clear increase. About 30% of the desert's surface supported some form of plant life. A decade later, that figure reached 50%, with engineered restoration zones leading the advance. This transformation is not just a trick of the eye or a seasonal shift. Time series data from Landsat and MODIS satellites confirm a statistically significant rise in greenness across the Ordos Kubuki region. In engineered plots, the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, NDVI, values climbed steadily, showing that new growth was not just surviving, it was expanding. Independent reviews of the imagery show the checkerboard patterns of straw grids giving way over time to mosaics of shrubs, grasses, and shelter belt trees. What began as scattered oases now forms a contiguous belt, visible even at the scale of national land cover maps. On the ground, the evidence is even more granular. Soil samples collected in restored zones reveal a marked increase in organic matter. Where once the sand held less than half a gram of carbon per kilogram, restored plots now register several times that amount. The surface, once loose and lifeless, has hardened into a crumbly, darker layer, proof that roots, litter, and microbes are remaking the substrate. Rainfall, when it comes, soaks in more deeply and lingers longer, supporting a wider web of life. Wildlife surveys back up the remote sensing. Insects, birds, and small mammals have returned to areas that were barren within living memory. Species counts in restored plots now routinely include larks, shrikes, and burrowing rodents, all dependent on the new vegetation for food and shelter. Even predators, foxes, and raptors have been sighted where only drifting sand once moved. The economic impact is measurable as well. Licorice and sea buckthorn, both planted for their resilience and value, are now harvested at scale, supporting new jobs in processing and trade. Ecotourism and renewable energy projects, especially solar installations, have followed the greened corridors, bringing additional revenue to local communities. Financial records from Elion, the lead company, and statements from Chinese government partners suggest that direct investment in ecological restoration over 30 years totals several billion yuan. While no independent audit confirms a precise figure, company estimates place the cost of the core restoration work at a fraction of what was spent on failed mega projects elsewhere. The result? More than 6,000 square kilometers of desert stabilized and greened by 2020 occurred at a scale and speed that defied early skeptics. For scientists and policymakers, the proof lies in the convergence of these lines of evidence: satellite trends, soil chemistry, species return, and economic output. Kubuki stands as a rare case where transformation is visible from space, measurable in the ground, and reflected in the lives of people who now depend on a living landscape rather than a shifting sea of sand. In the Kubuki Desert, transformation did not rest on technology or government decree alone. The real engine was a partnership between private enterprise and local communities, anchored by Elion Resources Group. At the heart of this effort was Wang Wenbiao, a former salt factory manager who saw opportunity where others saw only sand. Under his leadership, Elion shifted from extracting resources to repairing landscapes, building a model where ecological restoration and economic development moved together. Thousands of local residents were recruited into organized sand treatment teams. These were not short-term laborers, but long-term stewards, many drawn from families who had lived on the desert edge for generations. Each team took responsibility for a section of dunes, maintaining straw grids, planting seedlings, repairing fences, and monitoring survival rates. Over time, these teams became the backbone of the project, their work visible in the steady advance of green across the sand. Elion's approach did more than halt dune migration. It created jobs where there had been only outmigration and poverty. Farmers who once herded livestock on shrinking grasslands now earned steady wages planting licorice and sea buckthorn, or tending nurseries and managing irrigation. The company offered training, equipment, and performance-linked bonuses. As restoration succeeded, new roles emerged in plant processing, ecotourism, and renewable energy. By the late 2010s, over 5,000 local workers were directly employed in desert control and related industries, with many more benefiting indirectly from improved land and new business opportunities. Recognition for the Kubuki model came from beyond China's borders. Wang Wenbiao received international awards for ecological leadership, and the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification named Kubuki as a global demonstration site. But within the region, the most tangible rewards were found in daily life: reduced sandstorms, rising incomes, and a sense of pride in reclaiming land once thought lost. The partnership between Elion and local communities proved that large-scale restoration could be both an ecological and economic project, sustained not by subsidies but by shared investment and shared returns. As the Kubuki experiment matured, its lessons rippled outward. The same corporate community model was adopted in other deserts, scaling up what had begun as a local gamble into a template for national restoration. The story of Kubuki is not only about plants and sand, but about governance, about what happens when local people are given a stake in the land's future, and when restoration is built into the fabric of daily work and livelihood. By the late 1990s, the lessons from Kubuki began shaping a much larger strategy. China set out to apply its ecosystem-first approach across some of the world's harshest deserts. The Gobi, the Tengger, and the Mu'us, each with its own climate, soil, and challenges, became new testing grounds for restoration. Instead of a single blueprint, program managers adapted the method to fit local realities, choosing species and techniques that matched the land's limits. In the Tengger, straw checkerboards and drought-tolerant shrubs slowed the movement of sand and let native grasses take hold. Along the edges of the Gobi, shelter belts of poplar and willow were planted only where groundwater was accessible, while vast stretches relied on hardy shrubs and low-input grassland. The Mu'us Desert, once notorious for dust storms that reached Beijing, saw a patchwork of grass, shrub, and tree belts designed to buffer wind and trap moisture. These efforts were not isolated experiments. They were part of the 3 North Shelter Forest Program, launched in 1978, which aimed to build a living barrier stretching 4,500 kilometers across northern China. By 2020, official figures show that more than 30 million hectares, over 300,000 square kilometers, of new forests and shelter belts had been established under this program. Remote sensing confirms dramatic gains in vegetation across northern China's drylands, with over half of treatable desertified land now under some form of ecological management. The scale is unmatched anywhere else. What began as a local solution in Kubuki became a national project, with each desert teaching its own lessons and forcing new adaptations. The result is a mosaic of restored land that stretches from the Yellow River Basin to the far edge of Inner Mongolia, a living demonstration that large-scale desert restoration is possible when local ecology guides every step. Across North Africa and the Middle East, new pilot projects are underway, testing whether China's ecosystem-first approach can work beyond its borders. Ministries in Egypt, Jordan, and Morocco have each launched small-scale trials, guided by technical exchanges with Chinese desert scientists. In Egypt's western desert, agronomists are experimenting with native shrub belts and straw grids, aiming to stabilize sand and rebuild soil with minimal irrigation. In Jordan, a partnership with Chinese research institutes has introduced drought-tolerant species in degraded rangelands, monitoring survival rates and soil moisture over several seasons. Morocco's forestry agency is working with local communities to plant native acacias and grasses, focusing on areas where overgrazing and wind erosion have stripped the land bare. These efforts are early, measured in pilot plots rather than sweeping landscapes. Yet they represent a quiet shift in strategy. Instead of importing foreign trees or pouring billions into concrete and steel, each country is adapting restoration to its own desert logic. Technical teams track changes in soil organic matter, plant survival, and biodiversity, sharing results through South-South cooperation forums. The world's deserts stretch across 36 million square kilometers, nearly a quarter of the Earth's land. For these pilots, success depends not on copying China's blueprint exactly, but on matching native species, patient timelines, and local stewardship to the realities on the ground. As more countries test these principles, the question is no longer whether deserts can be restored, but what it takes to make restoration last. Today, 1/3 of the world's land faces degradation, and the stakes are rising. China's ecosystem-first methods offer a living counterpoint to failed megaprojects, proving that patient adaptation can outlast brute force. The future of restoration depends on listening to the land. The lesson is clear: resilience grows from understanding, not conquest. What approach would you choose? Share your thoughts below.